And then I'm also going to, and it'll take a few seconds for it to start, but put us on Facebook Live.
Okay, great.
On the Philly Family Pride page. So I'm going to start doing that now. And there's like a 15-ish second delay, but don't try to have it on in the background. I'll keep an eye on it, because if you have both things on, the sound can be weird.
Okay.
Like there can be a weird delay echo thingy. Cool. And I'll start us off. It's not live yet. I have to say what the title is and stuff. And then I'll turn it over to you two to talk, and I'll turn off my video and audio and share 2 pages, groups. Yes. We have so many nice options now. So I will, once the Facebook Live thing starts, I will introduce you both. We'll give it we'll just start. I'll introduce you both. I'll turn off my video and audio, but I'll be keeping an eye on the Facebook Live chat, so you don't have to worry about that. And so then I can, if you prefer me to be like a disembodied voice for questions, I can do that. Or if you prefer me to type in the Zoom chat to tell you to relay any questions, if there are any, I can do that.
Okay.
So
do you prefer one or the other, Becca? I'm okay with either.
Yeah, you can ask them. So sometimes I don't see the chat. So I'll be interested if we get questions. So
okay. I mean, I'll probably also ask a couple questions.
Okay.
Just myself.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm hitting
You're a
the go
moderator.
live. Yeah. So I'm going to hit the go live button. So here we go. And here we go. So hello, everybody. My name is Stephanie Haynes, and welcome to Demystifying Surrogacy as a way to form your LGBTQ plus led family. I am the director of Philadelphia Family Pride. I use she, her pronouns. If you don't know about PFP, we are a nonprofit group that works with LGBTQ plus parents, prospective parents, grandparents, and our kids of all ages in the greater Philadelphia area. Tonight, we have with us Andrea McAfee, who's the founder of the Surrogacy Center of Philadelphia, and attorney Becca Nayak, who I should also mention is a member of the Philly Family Pride Board of Directors. Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions, please drop them in the Facebook chat. And that will be it for my little part. So thank you, and take it away, Andrea and Becca.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us. I know that Becca provided some slides, so I think we'll get going, starting out first with some of the information that she has.
Becca, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Andrea, can you hear Becca? I can't hear you either because I think you're muted. Sorry to interrupt.
Not very clearly, Becca, if you want to try to repeat.
Thanks for everybody's patience.
Can you guys
All right,
hear?
Becca, yeah, that's better.
Okay, well now attorneys are standing by with the headset. Okay, so hopefully you guys can hear me now. Did you hear my introduction?
No, why don't you repeat it? Go ahead.
Okay, yes, okay, I'll try again. So I'm Becca Nayak. I'm an attorney at Jerner Law Group. We're located in Philadelphia, sort of East Falls, Germantown area, but serve really people all over Pennsylvania and New Jersey in a number of practice areas. I do family law, including adoption and assisted reproduction law. And so that's a little bit about what we're going to talk today. So in getting started, first I wanted to discuss a little bit of the terminology around art terms that you might hear. So when we refer to assisted reproductive technology, what we're referring to is really any time that there is sort of conception with sperm and egg outside of the body. When we say intended parent, we're referring to a person who wants to become a parent and uses some form of assisted reproductive technology to conceive, be that an egg donor, sperm donor, gestational carrier, or some combination. A donor is a person who donates eggs, sperm, or in some cases embryos. A gestational carrier, and that's really what we're going to focus on a lot in today's presentation, is a person who carries a pregnancy using an embryo that is not made of their genetic material, as opposed to a traditional surrogate where the person who's carrying the pregnancy is also the person whose egg is used in the pregnancy. So, Andrea, do you want me to continue?
Sure. Why don't you continue a little bit more and then I'll jump in on the surrogacy piece.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how an intended parent becomes a legal parent for those using surrogacy. And there are really two areas for gay male couples who are using surrogacy. A lot of times, you're going to have an egg donor involved. That can be a known donor or an unknown donor. Many times an unknown donor is through an agency that might, or a bank that might already have terminated any potential rights of the donor with contracts that they have on file with the egg bank. If you're using a known donor, there's going to be a contract between you and the known donor. And sometimes there's even contracts between specific egg donors that are identified by a number and a specific intended parent. So that's, and then also there are gestational carrier agreements, which we'll talk about more in depth later. So in Pennsylvania, there's no statute governing assisted reproductive technology, unlike many other states, including neighboring Delaware and New Jersey. In Pennsylvania, though, we really do have great law regarding donors. We have a case that went up to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania over a decade ago called Ferguson versus McKiernan. And that case states that a donor, in that case it was a known donor, is not liable for child support, and that donor contracts are fully enforceable in Pennsylvania. And the same reasoning in that case applies to egg donors and embryo donors, that contracts regarding donation of genetic material are enforceable, as are gestational carrier agreements. And again, I'll talk about that more in depth in a minute. So donor contracts need to be in place prior to conception using a donor egg, donor sperm, or donor embryo. These contracts establish the rights and responsibilities of all parties involved. The parties should be informed of counseling resources so they can establish their expectations prior to moving forward with the pregnancy. Primarily, a donor contract should also be very clear about expectations as to what everyone's legal rights are involved. It's very important. Sometimes people who are conceiving of using perhaps a friend as a donor might imagine that that person might have a special place in a child's life, but it's very important to remember that a donor is a donor, and that any relationship that they have with a child in the future is really fully in the discretion of the parents or intended parents. It also is important to make sure that the contract is drafted according to the law of the state that's going to apply. There definitely needs to be a connection. So if someone's living in Pennsylvania, a Pennsylvania contract, is advisable. If someone's living in New Jersey, sometimes these contracts involve people in more than one state. And so sometimes we'll coordinate with attorneys in another state so that we have an attorney for each state that law may apply. So before I launch into gestational carrier agreements, I'm going to let Andrea talk a little bit about how people meet each other, sort of the process involved.
Sure, absolutely. So let's say you have your embryos kind of ready to go, and now you're ready to take the next step, which is gestational surrogacy. Our agency, which is the Surrogacy Center of Philadelphia, specializes in facilitating these surrogacy journeys from beginning to end. So we first do an intake of the parents and see kind of what you're expecting of the process, what your expectations are in terms of the relationship that you would like to have, what kind of budget you have, if you have any other preferences or restrictions regarding all kinds of issues, whether it's contact, whether it is things like selective reduction or abortion. There are a lot of issues that are preferences that families need to kind of discuss with us so that we can find you the right match. What we do is we screen surrogates to ensure that they meet all the requirements for the surrogacy process. That means making sure they meet the medical requirements, that they're healthy, that they have been able to carry a pregnancy successfully in the past and actively have parented a child in the past. That they come from a steady background, that they're psychologically open and able to do this. We do full psychological evaluations, as well as various other background checks that we conduct to make sure that the candidate is really somebody that you want carrying your baby for you, right? So once the surrogate gets through that entire screening process, that's when we then look at her preferences too, because really it's a little bit like matchmaking in the sense that we're making sure that we can have a healthy, good relationship between these two parties. So we want to make sure that everyone is on the same page about their preferences on some very important issues. So similarly to the parents, we also make sure that we do a good intake of the surrogate to ensure that all her preferences are met as well. If we can match everybody up, that's when we then first exchange some profiles, first on paper, and then as an agency, what we do is then facilitate a meeting between the parties. It is a meetup, and you do take your time to get to know this person on both sides. Once everyone is comfortable, and sometimes it takes a couple of facilitated meetups. As an agency, our job is to make sure everybody is 100% comfortable before taking the next step. That's when we then say, okay, everyone's committed to this process verbally. Now we need to get a contract in place. And so that's when we circle back in with Becca's team as the attorneys, as well as other attorneys in the area, to ensure that we then draft a gestational carrier agreement that represents the needs of both sides and really identifies all the pieces that need to go in place before we jump into seeing a clinic and getting anybody pregnant. So Becca, if you want to explain kind of what's in those contracts.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again.
I'm just going to jump in real quick and ask a question. So, when we talk about pregnant people in Philly Family Pride, we generally use gender neutral pronouns, but it sounds like maybe surrogates to this point anyway have been people who are cisgender females. So you're using, she pronouns. Are trans men or non-binary folks able to become surrogates if they meet the other criteria?
Yes, if they meet the other criteria, exactly. Yes.
Okay, totally great. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the law behind gestational carrier agreements. So gestational carrier agreements are fully enforceable in Pennsylvania. Again, we don't have a statute governing this, But what we do have is case law that's developed over a number of years. The most important case is in Pennsylvania is called In Re Baby S. And that's actually a case that my firm was involved in about 2016. And that case involved a gestational carrier, an intended mother, and intended father. They used a donor egg to conceive, and in the middle of the pregnancy, intended mother and intended father separated, and the mother no longer wished to be a parent to the child that the gestational carrier was pregnant with. The child was born, and the gestational carrier's name went on the birth certificate because the intended mother did not cooperate in the process to ensure that didn't happen. And what happened is after trial, the trial judge said, you contracted with the gestational carrier. That contract is enforceable in Pennsylvania, and we're going to enforce it. And you are a parent of this child. The mother appealed to the Superior Court in Pennsylvania, and the Superior Court, upheld the trial court's decision. She tried to appeal to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, and they would not hear the case. So out of this terrible situation, we ended up with really good law in Pennsylvania that makes it explicitly clear that gestational carrier agreements are enforceable. Because I practice in New Jersey as well, I do want to mention also that in New Jersey, we have the Gestational Carrier Act that was passed in 2018. And so in both states, so that gave us a statute in New Jersey, and in both states, gestational carrier agreements, therefore, are enforceable. When we draft these agreements, it's really important to have an attorney on both sides, one representing the intended parent or parents, it can be a single person, and the gestational carrier and her spouse and the gestational carrier's spouse or partner. So what goes into the contract? Andrea talked about, before I get involved, she makes sure people are on the same page, but there are really, detailed language that go into the contract because we want to make sure things go as smoothly as possible and that any possible thing that could come up that we address on the front end so that we don't have a problem on the back end. So most importantly, we make sure that it is clear that the intended parents are legally responsible for the children and that they will be legal parents to the child, and the gestational carrier is not a parent to the child. We have to look at what law is going to apply. Oftentimes or most times we'll draft under the law of the state where the child will be born. There are exceptions to that. Some states do give full faith and credit to an order from another state. So occasionally it might make sense for whatever reason to draft under a law other than where the child's going to be born. But we have to determine what law is going to apply. And also the legal intentions of all the parties, make sure everyone's on the same page regarding what is going to be legally involved in the process. Making sure that there is health insurance that's going to cover the gestational carrier's pregnancy is also really important. So we will have the carrier's health insurance policy reviewed to make sure that it does not contain an exclusion for a gestational carrier. And so, and if it does contain an exclusion, that's okay. We're able to get other insurance products in place to make sure that the pregnancy is going to be covered. There's also a pre-screening process, and Andrea can talk a little bit about this as well. Oftentimes, by time I'm involved, the carrier has gone through that process. But there are physical exams and psychological evaluations that are involved as well. Also in the agreement, it talks about participation in medical appointments, medical supervision, and lifestyle restrictions, making sure that the gestational carrier is going to comply with going to all scheduled appointments, but also making sure that everyone's on the same page on things like how much caffeine is okay. Where can you go these days during COVID? What type of contact involved? Andrea, before I go on, do you want to add anything about the sort of from your perspective, what you see with the medical clearances and the psychological clearances?
Yeah. So our agency, we make sure to review all the medical records of the gestational carrier to make sure that she meets all the requirements. So like I said, healthy pregnancy, but we also want to make sure that, she has not experienced anything in her prior pregnancies that would be considered high risk. We want to make sure that the process is safe for everybody involved. So if we deem that there's, something that had come up in a previous pregnancy that might put her at risk later on, we're going to say no. So it's really important to make sure that, your surrogate's thoroughly screened because we want this safe process for everybody and we want a successful outcome. The psychological evaluation, that is done separately by a separate independent psychologist. What we're looking for is really two things. Of course, there is an evaluation looking for mental illness, but we're also looking at exploring the surrogate's motivation and what are the reasons for becoming a surrogate? Are they altruistic? What kind of coping mechanisms does this person have? Are they able to deal with stress? Because surrogacy is stressful and there's people are putting a lot of expectation on you. So we want to make sure that the person has outstanding coping mechanisms, healthy coping skills, and all of that. So all of that goes into the psych evaluation. We're not just testing somebody for psychological illness. We're looking really to see, are they able to handle the surrogacy process? And so that's kind of part of that pre-check that happens before really, in our case, before you ever see a surrogate's profile. Certainly other agencies may be different. Sometimes they do the psych evaluation after the match happens. We don't believe that's really a good idea because we don't want anyone to get your heart set on a person and then sorry, she failed the psych screen. So that's why we want to make sure to do that all up front. But the contract itself will state that these things have been performed. And so when you're entering into the agreement, you know that the person that has been identified as your surrogate has gone through all of these checks ahead of time. And the surrogate consents to that and says, yes, I have done this. And it's really important to make sure that that's kind of in your agreement. So nobody can come back later on and say, well, I didn't quite do those things. We all want to make sure it's all in there and outlined very clearly.
Okay,
This is Stephanie again. I'm just going to jump in. So, it sounds like, you try to plan for every possible eventuality on both sides, but I assume that there's some things you can't really plan for. A pandemic might be one of them. But, so I'm wondering what happens when surprises do happen that aren't already spelled out? Do you amend the agreement or do you just sort of hammer those things out as they happen?
Well, it depends on the surprise. In terms of a pandemic, what we have often done is, our language that we work very closely with Becca and our other attorneys. And so whenever a situation comes up that we think will have broad impacts on everybody, we go back and say, how can we adjust our agreements to make sure that they, protect all parties involved? Do we need to insert a COVID clause? Yes. A couple years ago, it was a Zika clause because Zika was the thing. And so we're always kind of making sure that we're staying up to date with whatever is happening in the world and adding in those protections. Can you, put everything into your contract? This is when a good seasoned attorney comes in too, because what I always counsel my parents and the gestational carriers is that in the end, you really can't put everything in. And if there was ever an issue and you went before a judge might say, you know what, having a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in there, you're not going to fight over that, are you? So there's certain things that maybe we would say, you know what, we're not putting it in the contract language. Let's talk this out a little bit. That seems a little silly, but there are a lot of things that we do adjust for and add language. And as an agency, our responsibility is to always kind of be listening to all the parties, to be able to go back to the attorneys and say, hey, can we put some language in here? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. I don't think that'll work out for us, or maybe that language. So I don't know, Becca, if you want to talk a little more about that.
Yeah, I think COVID is the perfect example because I think, before March, no one really saw it coming, and it really showed how, nimble we need to be. But it also showed how some of these clauses actually operate. Fortunately, all of my intended parents from other countries and within the United States were able to get here for the birth of their children. I know that wasn't the case for everyone, especially intended parents from China. But we have clauses, for example, saying, what happens if, who's a guardian if you are not able to be there, for the birth of your child, or in a very sad circumstance, if one of the intended parents or both were to pass away before the child was born. So we do think about these things. And we also coordinate with people, if intended parents are coming from another country or another state, it is important to coordinate with attorneys there. I think, particularly when COVID hit, it was very, very important to have attorneys that we were working with in the countries where the intended parents live, because what ended up happening when our passport offices closed here, and usually the babies that are born here go home on an American passport, that wasn't available, and we had to work with attorneys in other countries so that they could get travel documents from their consulates so that the babies could go home on those papers. So there really are a number of contingencies, but yes, every contract I've seen since March definitely has numerous COVID provisions. So that's something that the contracts do evolve over time, and certainly that is in there now. So I can talk a little bit. I'm going to go into more detail about what obtaining a pre-birth order really involves later, but I'll say now that the contract sets forth the process, that everyone's going to cooperate and what needs to be done to establish legal parentage. It also talks a lot about payments. What is everyone's expectation? Usually there's some sort of base fee that's paid on a monthly basis. There, is discussion of where the money is going to be held. That's very important to make sure that it's in somewhere where usually an escrow account with their numerous escrow companies that are responsible for holding the money. Making sure that the payments are sent in a timely manner. And so there's usually, like I said, the monthly payment, but then also payments for special circumstances. There's language regarding payment of legal fees, maternity clothes, what happens if there's a C-section, what happens if there's a pregnancy of twins or multiples, what happens, if the carrier is put on bed rest and can't work, how is that covered? So we think of, contingencies regarding the payment schedule as well. Also, we make sure that there are insurances. In addition to health insurance, which I talked about before, usually there is a life insurance policy taken out. Sometimes that benefit is split between the person who the carrier names and the intended parents. There's also usually a loss of reproductive organ policy, and then possibly short-term disability policy, a bed rest or a bed rest policy, something that's available through Andrea's agency. It also, we discussed this, I think Stephanie's question was very good. We definitely include all sorts of contingency provisions that, when we're going through these contracts on both ends with the intended parents and the carriers, we'd have to think about all these potential horribles. What if there's a medical error and the wrong embryo is transferred? Who is responsible for that child? And the answer is it's the intended parents, but that's spelled out in the contract. What if an intended parent dies? It makes clear that that child is still the child of the intended parent. It also makes sure, and this is very important, Andrea mentioned this when she was discussing her screening process and how matches are made, but intended parents and carriers need to be on the same page about what would happen if perhaps there was a genetic abnormality or some reason where a they may not want to continue with the pregnancy. And so it's very important to make sure everyone is on the same page with that, because of course it's the carrier who has a constitutional right to determine whether or not they'll be pregnant. But in the agreement it says that the carrier understands that she's carrying a pregnancy for the intended parents, and that the carrier will listen to the direction of the intended parents if there were one of these situations that would come up. Of course, everyone very much wants children that are conceived in this way, but it does discuss what would happen in that circumstance. It also talks about access to records and information so that the intended parents are able to have information from the doctor's appointments, perhaps even be at the appointments, on FaceTime during the appointments. Make sure everyone understands what the intended parent's involvement is going to be during the pregnancy and at the hospital. And I'll let Andrea jump in there because I certainly, discuss it in legal terms. She lives it more in what this actually, looks like.
Sure. So I guess backing up a little bit, when we talked a little bit about compensation, because that's always a big piece of this. And parents always want to know, how do we budget for this? Where does the money go? Who am I paying? What am I paying for? So when you have an agency involved like us, we think of it as spoke and hub, right? So we're in the center and there are all these providers, medical providers, legal providers, escrow agents, all these folks that are involved in your surrogacy journey. And everyone has to talk to each other and everyone has to be coordinated, and there has to be kind of smooth handoffs between all these different parties. And so our job is to coordinate all of that. One of the pieces is, of course, budgeting for your journey. It's really important to understand that there are all these different pockets of money that need to be paid for. Yes, you're paying your carrier, but you also, need to set aside funds for things like insurance if you need it, in different insurance products, not simply health insurance, but also life insurance, lost wages, disability, all of that all needs to be in there. And you have to be ready kind of for some of these potentially unknown bills, maybe if there are any kind of complications that occur during the pregnancy, sometimes you'll have a higher copayment. So what we do is make sure that parents understand how to properly budget for their surrogacy journey. And then we establish or help with the escrow accounts. So we believe in having completely independent escrow. And what that means is there's a separate company, not just a separate account, but a separate company that helps manage your escrow funds. Similar to the way, and I hate using this comparison, but it is what it is when you buy a home, that money goes into escrow and it is considered an independent escrow account. And part of that is to signal to the other party that you are committed to this process, you are under contract with them, and that you have set aside enough funds to kind of carry through this entire journey. So we always say, you set aside a chunk. It's usually defined exactly by the dollar amount in your contract. But then going forward, then once you get pregnant and we start dispersing those funds as an agency, we still adhere directly to the contract. So the contract essentially has a payment schedule in it. And as an agency, when we issue a directive to the escrow company to please disperse, it's exactly by the terms of that contract. And it's super important that you kind of make sure that your escrow account is being managed in that very clean manner, that there's not a commingling of funds of, hey, just pay us a bunch of money as an agency and we'll make sure to dole out your bills for you. Don't do that. Sometimes when you hear some of these stories, not so happy experiences, it's because that wasn't done properly. So it's super important that you're working with an agency that has an independent escrow set up, that has complete transparency for you as parents, and you make sure that you can see all those transactions and everything is happening per the terms of your contract. So that's actually a lot of what we do when we're talking about kind of the pregnancy and managing what happens. There's a lot of bills and a lot of insurance. And so once your contract is in place, that's when we can then kind of jump into the medical piece of this. We can get your surrogate into the clinic. And she'll have to do a couple of other workups and intakes at that clinic, and a couple, more blood work, ultrasounds, and other evaluations to ensure that they're able to carry through this process safely. The clinic will then come up with a calendar that has the schedule of medications that need to be taken. And we all are kind of working together, the clinic and the agency, making sure that the surrogate is attending those appointments, that the medications are being taken properly according to the protocol, and that the body is responding as it should to that medical protocol to ensure that this cycle is successful. Hopefully it's one try, and then your surrogate is pregnant. At that point, the surrogate then would transfer to her regular obstetrician. Usually the OB is identified in the contract along with the delivery hospital. And so that it's very clear kind of who are the providers that are there. And as intended parents, which providers will give you information, what information is being released to you, medical information that's often protected to a different standard. And so we want to make sure that intended parents do have access to that information and are getting updates. So your contract has language in it. Very often the surrogate will also sign additional release forms from the clinic as well as from the obstetrician to ensure that the intended parents do get the information that they need. And so we just kind of carry forward then at that point, making sure that the surrogate is attending appointments, that she is doing well, that the baby is doing well. We ensure that all claims are processed properly through insurance. This insurance is billed for the surrogate, not for the intended parents. This is a very common question that we get asked. Well, if I have insurance and the surrogate is carrying my baby, wouldn't her care be covered under our insurance? No. She has to have her own policy. And as Becca had mentioned, we need to make sure that that policy does not have any exclusions, and to make sure that it says, yes, maternity care is covered, and maternity care, if you are under a surrogacy agreement, is covered. That's the kicker. It's not just maternity care. You need to make sure that it doesn't say that anybody under a surrogacy arrangement is excluded. There's often language that says that. So that is kind of carrying through the OB process and carrying through the pregnancy. As an agency, we're there to support the surrogate and the intended parents, ensuring that communication is flowing, that payments are being made in a timely manner. If anyone has any questions about insurance or billing, we help handle that. And then once we get to about the 5th month, which happens really fast, very often, we loop back with the attorneys again, because in this area, we can issue those pre-birth orders. So we want to get that done early, not a minute before your surrogate goes into labor. But I know Becca maybe is going to talk a little bit now about some of those birth orders and carrier actions.
Yeah, hold on.
And I know I keep interrupting right as you hand it off to Becca, but this is Stephanie again with another question. So you talked about OBs and hospitals. If the intended parents and the surrogate both wanted to use midwifery care and potentially even like a home birth or a birth center, I assume that's okay if all parties agree.
If all parties agree, yes. So long as all parties agree to that, and we would help facilitate that. So it's just important that everyone is on the same page. And a lot of intended parents will say that they are comfortable with, for example, a birth center, so long as there is potentially the ability to transfer safely to a higher level of care if necessary. And so we would make that decision early on in the matching process to ensure that all parties are comfortable with that decision.
Yeah, and that's something also that goes into the contract, what hospital, or, that the hospital, sometimes is going to have a certain level of NICU, or if it's not going to be a hospital, that would go in there. Before I talk about the pre-birth order process, I have a slide here about traditional surrogacy, because I think I mentioned it before, but it's really important to understand what it is and how it is legally different. So again, traditional surrogacy is when the person who's carrying a pregnancy, it is their egg. And so legally, so there's no prohibition against traditional surrogacy in Pennsylvania. Often it's possible to do an agreement, but really that agreement is more a memorandum of understanding. It's not likely legally enforceable because at the time of the birth, the person who gives birth is considered a legal parent. And so while any agreement that is done can show what the intentions of everyone involved is, it's important to understand that that is not enforceable in the same way that a gestational carrier contract is. And also, because it's governed by adoption laws, it cannot be compensated when you're doing traditional surrogacy. When people do traditional surrogacy, and there are some, reasons that people might choose that. One is, financial reasons. Also, it has less medical intervention as well. You know, so when we do see those arrangements, what we have to do is post-birth, do a second parent or step parent adoption if the people are married. So if both intended parents are married, they use traditional surrogate post-birth. We will proceed with an adoption to establish parental rights for the person who is not biologically related to the child at the time of birth. And then we'll actually do a termination of parental rights of the traditional surrogate. So I just wanted to make a note about that. As I said before, knowing the law of the states that apply are really important. So I have a couple links here. One is a map that you can link to, a map that will show you what states, what the status of the law is in different states. Some states do not allow gestational carriers. Also, some states do. For many, in February, New York just passed a law that will go into effect in February. So it will be legal in New York starting in February. But their law, is very nuanced, as are many laws in many states. So it's really important to work with an attorney that knows, the law, the ins and outs of the law in the state that's going to govern the, parentage order and the contract. Also, I wanted to mention here international surrogacy. I do see clients who work with gestational carriers in other countries, and it's very, very important to, before an embryo transfer, to make sure that there is a clear path to establish parentage prior to conception. In many countries where I'm seeing gestational carriers, that person's name will go on the birth certificate at the time of birth, and then we'll proceed with a step parent or second parent adoption when the family returns to the United States. But for example, if we're doing this with a single intended parent, that path may not work to terminate the gestational carriers' rights if they're in another country. And so it's really, really important to think about these issues on the front end. So those were a couple notes I wanted to make, but I'm going to talk a little bit more now about the pre-birth order process. So in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, both states have an established process for getting a pre-birth order. That order states that the intended parents are the legal parents, and that they, and not the gestational carrier, will go on the child's original birth certificate. In Pennsylvania, although we don't have a statute, we do have a very standardized procedure that was established by our Department of Health Administrative process that was developed by our Vital Records Office. And so, we get all the necessary documents. It will include affidavits from a doctor who was involved. It will discuss, if there is the use of donor egg or donor sperm, how the donor's rights were, cut off if there was a contract. It will, have affidavits from the intended parents as well as the gestational carrier and the gestational carrier's spouse or partner. And we'll compile all of this into a petition. In Pennsylvania, we send that to Vital Records for pre-approval prior to filing the action with a court. It can get, depending on where everyone is, we might, usually I file it in the county where the carrier is going to give birth, but depending on the circumstances, if the intended parents and the carrier are both in Pennsylvania, it could be filed in the jurisdiction where the intended parents live. So we have some choices we can make, and we will get that order from a court prior to the birth. In most counties, a hearing is not required. There are a couple exceptions to that, but usually it's on the papers. And then we have that order in place. We send it to the hospital prior to the birth. And then after the birth, there's certain paperwork that needs to be sent to Vital Records for issuance of the birth certificate. And New Jersey is very similar in terms of the affidavits and such that would be attached to the petition for the gestational carrier action. So that is sort of in terms of how we would establish the legal parentage once the pregnancy is achieved. So Andrea, did you have things you wanted to add?
Well, yeah, usually, that's kind of what we do around 5-6 months, right, of the pregnancy. So we want to make sure that that's all underway, so that if baby makes an early arrival, we're all not scrambling. We want that all to be in place. And so the other piece of this is that as an agency, we want to make sure a birth plan is in place. And that is important to have, both so that the intended parent and the surrogate are on the same page about what happens in the delivery room, but we also say it's also for the hospital staff, so that nobody is asking an awkward question mid-contraction, right? We want to make sure everyone knows what's going on, who's the support person for the gestational carrier, the intended parents, what their preferences are in terms of what happens after birth. Does the baby receive what kind of care does the baby receive? Do you want the baby to have, an hour of quiet alert time, no one touching, just quiet bonding time? Then we put all of that in the birth plan to make sure that it's really clear to everybody involved, both the gestational carrier, the intended parent, as well as the hospital staff. And we work on that early to make sure that it's all in place, along with the parentage orders. So that's another piece of one of the things that an agency will do, is help facilitate that birth plan and make sure it's communicated to all the relevant parties, so everyone's on the same page. And then, of course, on birth day, we are there as best as we can, given COVID. Delivery rooms cannot be very crowded nowadays, but we make sure to loop in with the hospital and chat with risk management, the charge nurse, the social workers. There's a whole list of folks that we talk to, so everyone is on the same page for delivery day. And the process goes very smoothly. So once baby is born, usually what happens is the intended parents get a separate space to bond with their child. The gestational carrier, hopefully, given hospital capacity, but hopefully is able to have a separate room to completely relax and recover there as well. So everyone kind of gets their quiet bonding space separately. It is an option if parents want to receive breast milk. That is something that often also goes into the contract as well. The gestational carrier is compensated for that, both the time spent pumping as well as any supplies. And so there's still a continuation after the birth, very often because of breast milk. As an agency, we can deliver it. It can be mailed. We've mailed it and shipped it internationally. There are ways to get milk where is needed for the baby. So, we continue on with that, make sure that everyone's discharged happily at home and healthy. And then we follow up with the hospital to make sure that all those bills are properly paid and insurance is being billed properly. Again, baby goes with intended parent insurance, surrogates insurance is their own. So we want to make sure that there is no entangling of that at the hospital, because that can cause a little bit of stress when claims are going to the wrong places and bouncing back afterwards, because that final delivery bill is probably the biggest bill that you're going to see as intended parents. So you really want to make sure that it's properly taken care of, and that you can go home and enjoy your baby without worrying about a big surprise bill coming later on. So we make sure as an agency to handle those pieces as well. And then after a few weeks, as Becca mentioned, once everything is in with vital records, and all the paperwork is done and processed, they will mail you the birth certificate of your child after a few weeks. Again, with COVID, things can sometimes run a little slow, but even with that, because we work so well with all these providers involved, we've been able, if we need to get that birth certificate done, we can call and help get it done. I mean, that's what having an experienced team is all about, is if they need to make that phone call for you, they can make that phone call for you. So yeah, so that's really kind of an end-to-end journey from beginning to end.
So this has been really great. I've just a couple more questions since we still have a little bit of time within the hour. What if any relationship then follows between the surrogate and the parents after the baby's born? Again, it sounds like the agreement probably has that in it, but I'm wondering how much
Yeah, I'll speak to
there's a
the
continued
agreement
involvement.
because that's the simple answer, and then I'll let Andrea talk about the reality. So in the agreement, there's no obligation either of the carrier or of the intended parents to have an ongoing relationship. And so the contracts, pretty much that's where they fall, that anything post, is really discretionary. You might see a couple variations, sending pictures or something like that. But this, unlike an adoption or an open adoption, there's where you might have a post-adoption contract. There's not an enforceable expectation that there is going to be that. But I'll let Andrea talk about the reality.
Sure. So again, actually pre-match, right? So we're talking way early. We say, okay, what is your expectation of this journey? What are you hoping for? Because everyone comes in with different expectations. Gestational carrier may say, I want updates all the time. I want to be an honorary member of the family. And so that would be a little on the edge, but I would say, okay, let's see, maybe we can find some intended parents that would love a close relationship to kind of continue on. And we make those matches. The point is to make sure that everyone is on the same page, to make sure that if you want this to kind of end post-delivery, 6 weeks postpartum, then that it ends. But most of the time, I would say the vast majority of the time, there is a friendly, open relationship that exists beyond the birth. Exchange of pictures, Christmas cards and holiday cards and things like that, because there are whole families that are involved. The gestational carrier has a family, very often a spouse, other children, and they know that that person's been pregnant this whole time. So what is the story that's going to be told then going forward? And so families have to decide what that story is going to be. And are they going to share it? And when are they going to share it? And these are all things to talk about and think about beforehand as you kind of enter in and consider a surrogacy journey, because every family is different and every family's needs are different. There's no wrong answer. And I always tell folks when they apply to a program, please be honest in your application and say what you are expecting of this process. Answering one way, hoping you'll get matched quicker, is not a good idea. The right gestational carrier is out there who meets the same expectations and of the process as you. So it's really important that everyone be very honest about what they're hoping for and looking for out of this, and so that we can get it right and have a really good quality match.
Yeah, and I've definitely even seen, and I'm sure you had this as well, where the relationship is ongoing, is really close, and sometimes maybe there is even a second journey with for a
Yes.
sibling.
Yes, that's very, very common. We have a lot of sibling journeys, and if possible, the same gestational carrier. Sometimes based on health concerns or other issues, the same gestational carrier cannot carry. But very often we find that these are lifelong bonds that are very healthy to have. It's like I said, it's everyone's family story, and how they choose to build that is their choice, and they should be able to have that. So.
That answered my other question, so. Anything else before we wrap up? This was
Well,
great.
I'm
Thank
always
you both.
open for questions. If you didn't catch my information on the last slide, I'm at Jerner Law Group. You can Google us. I'm always happy for people to reach out to me directly by phone or by email. My emails are Nayak, Nayak @jernerlaw.com. So feel free to reach out if you have specific questions. I'm always happy to do a consultation and answer those. And thank you, PFP, for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Same for me. You can get more information at philadelphiasurrogates.com and fill out an inquiry form there. I'm happy to have a consult, sit down, go over the process, all the numbers, and answer any questions that anyone has. My email address is andrea@philadelphiasurrogates.com.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so now I'll stop recording.